Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Women in STEM, an international comparison on current challenges and opportunities. My name is Yumiko Murakami, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Today, we welcome international experts in STEM who will be discussing issues around women in STEM fields, causes of these issues, as well as best practices and recommendations by sharing their cross-border insights. To mark the opening, please join me in welcoming Ms. Keiko Okada, Director General of Gender Equality Bureau of Japan.
Hello and welcome. My name is Keiko Okada, Director General of the Gender Equality Bureau, the Cabinet Office, Government of Japan. I am so grateful to welcome and all the speakers and the audience here to this meaningful webinar. The percentage of female researchers in science and engineering universities in Japan is lower than in other research fields. In the OECD, Japan has the lowest proportion of women entering natural science and engineering at the tertiary educational level. The percentage of female university presidents and vice presidents is also less than 10% in both science and engineering related institutions, indicating an urgent need to promote more women into top management in these fields. On the other hand, according to the 2018 OECD Program for International Student Assessment, the average performance of Japanese female 15-year-olds in science and mathematics is among the highest in the world, well above the average for boys and girls worldwide. In other words, although Japanese women have high potential, at least at the age of 15, their participation in the science and technology fields has been lagging behind. This suggests that the reason for the underrepresentation of women in science and technology is not due to the competence factors, but that there are environmental factors that prevent women from entering in these fields. In light of this situation, the Japanese government is strengthening incentives by allocating more resources to universities that promote women as presidents and vice presidents, as well as working to showcase female role models employed in scientific fields to eliminate unconscious biases, such as women are not suited for science. So through these efforts, we are committed to increasing the number of women studying and working in STEM and to promoting women to the top management in these fields. I'm sure that each country is taking various initiatives to address similar issues. I look forward to the discussion among today's speakers and their recommendations on how we can work together to address these international challenges. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much for great remarks, Ms. Okada. Before we get going, I would like to go over a brief rundown of today's event and some housekeeping notes. I will first introduce the background of this seminar, and this will be followed by individual presentation by each of the speakers. And after the presentations, there will be a panel discussion followed by a Q&A session. And if you'd like to pose questions to the speakers, please submit questions using the Q&A function that you will see on the screen. And we'll be accepting questions throughout the webinar. And these questions will be answered during the Q&A sessions as much as we can, as much as we have time allows. And let me also briefly introduce myself once again. Yumiko Murakami. I am a general partner at MPower Partners. We are Japan's first ESG global venture capital fund. I was very fortunate to have an opportunity to moderate the session on women in digital STEM education at the World Assembly for Women. This conference is well known around the world. It's called WOW. People call it WOW. And this conference is an international conference to promote gender equality. And this was held in Tokyo in December. I was very happy to hear many different views and different suggestions as to what should be done on this very important topic during this session that I moderated. And today, I am once again very lucky to be able to moderate another very interesting discussion on the same very important topic. So this webinar, obviously, the most important element here is to make sure that we take advantage of a very, very, very important pool of talents, and that's women in STEM. This is a challenge in terms of how the pool of women, the pool of talented women in STEM field is not well represented in Japan, but also in many other countries. So in other words, it's a very international challenge. And the most recent G7 summit held in Germany in 2022 recognized the importance of gender equality as well as digitization. And as one of the G7 countries, the government of Japan also understands the importance of increasing participation of women in STEM and raised this issue as one of the topics at WOW. And to further enhance this discussion held at the WOW conference ahead of Japan's G7 presidency this year, this webinar is organized welcoming international experts in this field as speakers. And the speakers today will be sharing their insights on the current state of the following two main issues. One, way too few women who are studying STEM, so low participation of women in the academic institutions, basically in the STEM field. And the second issue is, again, low participation of women in the labor market when it comes to STEM fields. So these two issues are going to be the focus of today's discussion. We will discuss potential causes, what is behind these challenges, and also, obviously, the most important part of discussion is going to be best practices that can be shared by many countries, and also recommendations. What should be done going forward? That's going to be the very important part of today's discussion. We will try to incorporate as many different perspectives as possible in terms of what academic institutions can do, what international organizations can do, NGOs, and obviously private sector companies. What is the best way to work together? That's also going to be another very important point I'd like to focus on today. So at the WOW session where I was able to moderate a very stimulating discussion, we discussed some of the underlying very important trends, which would include, for example, the trend that we have seen in Japan, which is also a pattern that's repeated in other countries, which is basically the very low level of interest or will among students when it comes to female students in particular to pursue STEM. As Ms. Okada said, it's not the question of academic ability or intellectual ability. It's perhaps related to social pressures, perhaps it's related to mindset, and perhaps it's related to the social and cultural environment that many female students are living in today. So that's one very important element to be addressed. And also the systematic challenges. Potentially, there are tax issues surrounding companies. There are more regulatory issues that are surrounding companies. Again, we're talking about the labor market here, which might make it a little bit more challenging for women to pursue careers in the STEM fields versus their counterparts, basically male counterparts. So these are the discussion points that I had in December, and we will be discussing some of the similar discussion points, but also there are going to be other elements that our speakers will probably raise in their comments. In terms of the recommendations we came up in December, we discussed how important it is to not only address issues of women, but also issues for men. So this should be taken as a societal issue and not just women issue. That's one recommendation that has that was raised. So let's make sure this is not just women, but the entire society. So any policies, any recommendations that we can come up with, they really should be looking at the entire population. That was a very important comment that came up. Another issue or another recommendation was to make sure that the mindset is always taken into consideration. So the cultural aspects as well as social aspects that can be potentially affected by, for example, media. So in terms of having a very active role of media in terms of changing the mindset, not only women, but also men, that's another important element. And that is also potentially a really important step that we can take as a society. So I'd like to move on to make sure we have enough time to listen to our speakers today. So let me introduce three amazing speakers we have today. Please welcome, first of all, Dr. Rie Kijima, co-founder of Sky Labo, and assistant professor and director of Initiative for Education Policy and Innovation at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, University of Toronto. Thank you so much for joining, Dr. Kijima. The second speaker we have today is Dr. Nergis Mavalvala, Dean of Science at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, as well as a professor of astrophysics at MIT. I like that combination. So thank you so much for joining us. And the third speaker is Miss Debora Comini, Director of UNICEF Regional Office for East Asia and the Pacific. So again, thank you so much for joining us to share your insights on this very important topic, women in STEM. Our first presentation will be by Dr. Rie Kijima, who will tell us about herself a little bit, and her focus will be more on the Japan side of discussion today. So she will discuss what she observes in terms of what is happening in Japan in terms of women in STEM, both in education and also in the labor market, and the possible causes for this. And by the way, let me also remind everyone who's listening to this webinar, you can please send in comments and questions anytime throughout the webinar. So without further ado, Dr. Kijima, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yumiko-san, for this kind introduction, and also for contextualizing the importance of this webinar. I have been inspired by your work, and you serve as a role model for many of us in Japan and beyond. I also thank the Prime Minister's Office of Japan for this very special invitation to participate in this session with other distinguished panelists. I would like to begin my presentation. Next slide, please. My name is Rie Kijima, and I'm a co-founder of Sky Labo and assistant professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto in Canada. I received my PhD from Stanford University and my bachelor's degree from International Christian University, ICU, which is a liberal arts college in Japan. Now, Sky Labo is a nonprofit organization that aims to cultivate the next generation of STEAM thinkers. Through our organization, we administer education workshops for middle and high school students, in particular girls, who live in Japan to provide them with an opportunity to elevate their interest in STEM fields. Next slide, please. In 2022, we administered different programs, and one of them was actually in Okinawa in partnership with the Okinawa Institute for Science and Technology Graduate School. We also implemented a program in collaboration with the city of Kyotango, which is in the Kyoto Prefecture, collaborating with the Board of Education to implement some of these changes and to integrate into the public education system. We also administered an online program with PwC Japan to foster and cultivate the next generation of STEM thinkers. Next slide, please. Now, to give a little bit more of the background context for why we might observe some of the gender disparity, I think it's important to think about data that is unique to Japan. So as of 2019, Japan had the lowest share of women studying science among OECD countries. Within STEM, the proportion of women entering natural sciences, mathematics, and statistics, these are at the heart of STEM fields. At the tertiary education level in Japan was at 17%, far below the 32% average among OECD countries. Next slide, please. The percentage of female researchers in Japan is also the lowest among the selected countries and regions. Now, the percentage or the proportion of female researchers in Japan is 17.5% in 2021. And although the percentage is the lowest among selected countries and regions, the number is the third largest after the UK and Germany. Next slide, please. So researchers have found out that this gender gap is largely explained by three self-belief constructs, often referred to as non-cognitive factors. And I raise these as one element in which we might be able to think about that connection between student interest and the mindset that also affect how girls feel and perceive the role of STEM. So I'm going to go a little bit more in detail to explain what these three concepts are. The very first one is self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is defined as one's belief that they can succeed at a particular task. Self-efficacy beliefs determine how people feel, think, and motivate themselves. Studies have shown that in general, girls have less belief in their own abilities and perhaps greater anxiety towards math and science than boys do. Some studies have also shown that girls rate their own ability as lower than that of boys as early as in their first years of primary school, even though their performances do not differ. Evidence also suggests that top-performing female students tend to experience more decline in self-efficacy compared to boys when faced with failure and setbacks. Now, self-concept, which is the second concept I'd like to talk about, is the perception you gain about your own self relative to what you think about your ability against someone else or within yourself. So studies have found that girls tend to have lower self-concept than boys in STEM fields. And scholars have attributed this to the fact that girls may be more sensitive, perhaps, to what others think of them, especially in years of adolescence, which affect their self-concept. The third element is motivation. Motivation refers to the desire to accomplish a certain task or a goal that one sets for themselves. There are two types of motivation. One is intrinsic, and the other one is extrinsic. Intrinsic motivation is the joy that comes internally, like enjoyment or deep satisfaction you gain from accomplishing a task or a goal that comes from within yourself. Extrinsic extrinsic motivation is driven by external factors, such as rewards that help achieve certain goals, like getting some reward associated with accomplishment that you have. Now, according to OECD, boys living in Japan reported greater enjoyment of learning sciences, right? That they have higher intrinsic motivation compared to girls. So these are some of the factors that perhaps might have some influences in the way that girls perceive that the role of STEM in their lives. I'm going to stop here and pass it over back to Murakami-san.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kijima. It was very insightful. So now next one is going to be presented by Dr. Nergis Mavalvala from MIT, who will talk about her insights from the U.S. perspective. So floor is yours.
I'm Nergis Mavalvala, and I'm an experimental physicist at MIT. In fact, this is a picture of me in my lab. I'm also currently serving as the dean of the School of Science, where I have oversight of all of the science departments at MIT: life sciences, natural sciences, mathematics. And part of my motivation for the leadership role that I'm playing at the moment is really to think about the participation of women and other minoritized groups that have traditionally not been able to participate in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM, at the fullest level. So next slide, please. Thank you. Good. So I want to tell you a little bit about the situation in the United States. So the first thing of note is that while women make up 48% of the total workforce in the United States, only 34% of the STEM workforce comprises women. And then if you drill a little bit deeper, you actually see that in computational and mathematical sciences, just barely a quarter of the workforce is women, and engineering is only 16%. So you can see that this is a real lost opportunity for where talented women could be participating in the workforce. Next slide, please. And so one place to start to look at where this discrepancy comes from, this disparity in the number of women, is to look at who, the education system and who is getting educated in STEM. And the first thing that we notice is that whilst 58% of all undergraduate degrees in the United States go to women, in STEM fields, it's less than half of that. And by the time we get to sort of higher degrees, which is where we start to populate research and high-tech sectors with PhDs, about 50% of all PhDs granted in the United States are earned by women. But in most STEM fields, it's much lower. So physics is the lowest, my field, at 21%, and computer science is just a little bit higher at about 24%. So you can see that the participation of women at every level of the educational pipeline diminishes, and certainly by the time we get to the workforce, it is notably diminished. So next slide, please. Good. So one could also look at qualitative factors, and this is very important to look at, because the numerical data will give us a snapshot of the conditions on the ground, but don't really tell us about the underlying causes. And one of the things that was done by actually this was carried out in the United States, but was a global a study that was done actually by an organization that's called the Global Survey of Scientists in 2020. And what was found was that there is an enormous gender gap in the experience of women who are participating in the STEM workforce among the US population and also internationally. So in fields like physics, engineering, and computer science, these disparities in the experience of how satisfied women are in their fields are already in place by the time students enter college, so right after high school. In the life sciences and biology, medicine, and chemistry, women are near parity at the bachelor's level, but then increasingly encounter barriers and biases. And certainly by the time you get to levels of advanced career and leadership, their numbers fall precipitously. So I'm going to, the next slide, please. So I'm going to close with this cartoon. And this is the cartoons are supposed to make us laugh, and this one makes us laugh and makes us cry. So on the left panel, you see two men, and they're working on a blackboard, and there's this nonsensical a piece of mathematics, which is that the integral of x squared is equal to pi. And the one man says to the other one, "Wow, you're really bad at math." And then on the right panel, it's a man and a woman who are working on the board, and the woman writes the same nonsensical piece of math, and the man says, "Wow, girls are really bad at math." And you can see how this plays out in the society. And many of these cultural barriers to participation of women in STEM are represented in this cartoon. The discrimination or the bias of the man who's looking on is apparent. The lack of role models is very much apparent for actually both of them. The man has no role model of women who can do math really well, and as Rie has told us about before, the woman has her own issues of self-efficacy and self-belief that are involved. And in all of this is the question of expectations, of confidence, of conformity. And so we have many social barriers to women participating in STEM, and in part because this is not a comfortable place when you have all of these, when you have to swim upstream so hard all the time. So I'll stop my remarks there and hand back to Yumiko.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mavalvala. It's really very, very actually punchy if you look at those two comparison. So let's go to Ms. Comini now. She will show us sort of the global views, to share her views in terms of how this issue is seen from a global perspective. So Ms. Comini, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yumiko-san, thank you for this invitation, this opportunity. Thank you to the Office of the Prime Minister of Japan. This is a great follow-up to the WOW conference I had the privilege of attending. I will give you a global perspective, very much emphasizing developing countries where I'm most involved with. And you will see there is a common thread building on the previous presentations. Now, you already probably know what UNICEF stands for. So I'll just give you a few lines about my organizations. I think that you can go to the next slide, please. So we are part of the United Nations. We are the agency specialized in promoting and protecting the rights of all children. There are two international conventions that guide our work: the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, because the rights of children and the rights of women are intrinsically connected. It's very hard to advance one without the other. We work in more than 190 countries and territory all over the world. We say we want to ensure that all girls and boys have good education, health, nutrition, protection, but we also want all children to be able to pursue their dreams, become what they want to become, what we call achieve their full potential in life, including girls. I'll go to the next slide, please. And on the current state of girls in STEM, now we see some progress. Overall, we have globally more girls in school today than ever before. But when it comes to STEM, yes, girls are underrepresented. We have a global figure of female students in STEM, only representing 35% of total enrollment. And it's even worse when we look at cutting edge fields such as artificial intelligence. Only 1 in 5 is a woman. So this is the background faced by the 600 million adolescent girls we have in the world today. But if we offer them the right opportunities, the resources needed, this generation is going to be the largest ever cohort potentially of scientists, of leaders, teachers, innovators, change makers. But we need to invest in this. We have some estimates that if countries reached 100% enrollment of girls in secondary education, their GDP would be boosted by an average of 10%. Now, let us look at some of the causes of underrepresentation. Now, the first reason starts in childhood and actually is damaging both boys and girls, and it is having a poor learning foundation. Globally, we have about 2/3 of 10 years old boys and girls who are unable to read a simple sentence. UNICEF calls this a learning crisis, and it's actually worsened now after the pandemic. It means that millions of girls and boys are not gaining the foundational literacy, numeracy skills to then build a STEM education. So far, both boys and girls are affected. Then we have gender-specific problems that start to specifically put girls at a disadvantage. And yes, I'm referring here to gender norms that create barriers to adolescent girls to continue their education. These gender norms are manifested through child marriage, early pregnancy, care work for families. There are evidence in the fact that in the age group 15 to 19 years old, only 1 in 4 girls is not employed, nor in education, nor in training, 1 in 4, while for boys it's 1 in 10. Yeah. Gender-based socialization starts when children are very young, continues throughout their lives. Young girls are often given toys that promote caring skills, not motor skills, and the opposite is true for boys. And this will later affect their choices in life, the subjects they choose in school, and then the career path open to them. We also have gender stereotypes and myths that have no base in reality, but continue to persist and produce exclusion and discrimination in STEM from early on in life for many girls. Yes, we have heard the myth that girls are not good at math. We know it's not true. And actually, the evidence we have from Southeast Asia, girls perform better than boys in math, in tests, in grade 5, but then they do not continue to higher STEM education. Why? When girls grow up in societies that retain stereotypes, that believe that STEM professions are not compatible with women, they undermine their confidence. And just knowing, even if they don't believe in it, but knowing their families and communities hold these beliefs will make them less likely to pursue a STEM career. And then please remember that those who suffer most are the girls from poor families, from marginalized communities, those that live in remote areas, those that are most exposed to natural disaster, man-made disaster. When we have disasters, when we have crises, girls face increased gender-specific risks, such as sexual abuse, violence, exploitation, and this takes their safety and dignity away, but also drastically reduce their chance to pursue higher education and then a STEM career. So we have many challenges, but we also have some good practices that I hope we will have time to see later in this webinar. Thank you very much. I think the last slide is the very last. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Awesome presentation from the 3 different perspectives. One focusing on Japan, and then the second one is mainly on the US, and the third one, which is more developing economies perspective. But I think what's interesting is all the three presentations had the same underlying theme, which is really about mindset. All of the speakers said that it is a mindset that plays a very big role in terms of what is happening in terms of, how women are not visible. They're not really showing up as much as men in whether it's school or labor market. So given that common theme, I'd love to move on to the discussion of this important topic. And from here, we would have a more active, interactive discussion among the speakers. And if there are any questions the audience would like to ask the speakers, please, again, send them through the Q&A function here. So let's all of us have a active discussion here. May I address the speakers by their first name, just to make it a little bit more friendly. So Rie, if you don't mind just starting off, just sharing your thoughts in terms of what can be potentially a good solution. Perhaps you have seen some good practices in other countries that can potentially help to address this self-efficacy or self-concept issue that you talked about. Would you comment on that?
Thank you, Yumiko. There are many, many things that I think we can do. And I can speak from my own experiences working at Sky Level and also taking on that other hat of being a scholar of education to evaluate some of the changes that were happening in the participants who participated in our STEAM design thinking workshop. So I can speak a little bit about that. We have been collecting data from all the participants from our workshop since 2016. And there are 5 factors, things that we have seen that have changed among the students who participate in our program. And I'm not going to talk about all 5, but I'll highlight 2 that are related to STEM. The very first one is that their interest in STEM changes after participating. And what does that mean? They initially come to our program thinking that STEM is something that's separate from their interest. I'm learning STEM for the first time. I'm not quite interested in it. But after the workshop, there's some real increased sense of interest in the subject matter of STEM. So that's one thing that has happened. The other thing that happens is that there's heightened interest in STEM. So their perceptions of STEM has changed over time. And what this means is that when the students come to our program initially, they think of STEM as someone, perhaps maybe a scientist working in the lab, alone, working with different elements, and that it's very individualistic endeavor. But after the program, people understand that actually STEM is quite interdisciplinary, that it's very creative, and that you also need to think out of the box, and that perhaps STEM is something that is so different from their initial concept of STEM. So we started understanding, well, what is making these girls think of STEM in a different way? And we can attribute that to 3 factors. The very first one is that we bring in near peer mentors into our program, and we call them design coaches. But these are typically graduate students or undergraduate students who are slightly older than the middle school, high school students who are interested in STEM, and they provide a lot of support throughout the program. Now, through this mentoring experience, the students feel that, oh, okay, now I can kind of imagine myself pursuing STEM like these undergraduate or graduate students. So that's something that we have found to be quite effective as one practice that we've identified in our program. The second is to bring a little bit more of that experiential learning by placing a STEM woman, a role model, into the conversation. So the group of students actually interview a women STEM leader who works at places like Panasonic, Hitachi. These are large manufacturing multinational corporations. And many of these middle school, high school students have never communicated with a STEM woman leader like that. Through interviewing, and it's not just them telling the students what to do and what they have done, actually the students come up with interview questions for them. So the drivers of the conversations are the students. And through that conversation, the students learn to live vicariously through the experiences of these women STEM leaders. That's another factor I think is a best practice that, that came out from our workshop. Now, the third thing is to create a very inclusive, safe learning environment. Now, as an educator, we often talk about the importance of creating that space for students to try, to fail, perhaps to be okay, making mistakes when you are called upon to answer a question, that it should be a safe environment for them to be able to express their thoughts and ideas. Now, we try to do that as much as we can. And I think one of the most important things is to ensure that that risk-taking is encouraged. And it's harder in a bigger, larger lecture course, but possible in a smaller, refined, and supported environment.
Great, thank you so much. So Nergis, what do you think of this idea of having a lot of different types of role models? Perhaps you can share your thought in terms of what can work in terms of underrepresented, women, role models in labor market that you mentioned in your presentation. What are the things that could be potentially learned, from other best practices that you have seen in your experience?
So we certainly can't underestimate the role of role models, but of course that alone won't get us all the way. But let me tell you a little story of an experiment that was done at Harvey Mudd College almost a decade ago now. Harvey Mudd College is actually a science and engineering college in California, and Harvey Mudd's president is Maria Klawe. And Maria herself is a computer scientist, and when she arrived at Harvey Mudd, she noticed that only about 10% of the computer science majors at the college were women, and so she took a three-pronged approach. So three pieces were, and role modeling is going to be a very important part of it. The three pieces she did was switch the code, visualize success, and make it matter. So let me tell you what each is. Switch the code is change the labels. So she renamed the introductory course, and she didn't say, a computer science for idiots. She said, this is a computing course for students who haven't had computing before. So she split into two parts, those who've coded before and those who haven't. That was the only difference, not for women, not for men, just that difference. The second thing she did was the part of visualizing success. So she really put a lot of her best women faculty to teach the course, and the women faculty members actually packed up all the women students in a van and took them to the biggest computer science conference in the country, and they really could visualize themselves as this being something that they could be part of. And then the third part of her approach was to make it matter. And that was that she started to create opportunities for students to apply what they learned in their introductory computer science course to those problems that they cared about, including a group of students who made a new version of Dance Dance Revolution for the elderly, or using computer technology in other ways. And by the end of her 4 years of the experiment, more than 40% of the computer science class was women. And the same experiments, by the way, have been repeated at UC Berkeley, at Duke, at Northwestern. So it's been a very successful model. So you can see role models was the middle piece of it, but you needed the two other parts of it as well, the rebranding and making it matter as well. So that's a story that I love to tell, because it tells us it can be done, and there is actually a good formula for it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Debora, what do you think of these two suggestions in terms of having a very, visible role models and trying to change the mindset by basically showing what can be done. Perhaps, things are a little bit different in the countries that you have been working or observing. The social and economic situations are perhaps different. So, Deborah, if you don't mind sharing some of your, observations and thoughts in terms of what can be done to address this issue.
I will share one experience that I have observed that is quite successful right now in about 20 countries globally, 3 in East Asia and 3 in South Asia and in other parts of the world. And I think this is a good experience to share. We call it Skills for Girls. It is very much focused on girls from deprived communities, whether they are rural, remote, and it's really focused very much on motivating them to learn STEM and to then increase their participation in skilled work. That's why it's Skills for Girls. And what do they need to participate? Yeah, role models are definitely an issue. There are less role models in developing countries than developed countries, so we need to start building a new cohort. What are the skills they need to build this cohort? Negotiation skills, problem solving, decision making, digital technology, and then provide support, mentorship, leadership development, that kind of skills that build confidence. And we need to keep the girls at the center of the program from the very start. And let us please remember that these kinds of programs touch real people and real lives. I was talking with a colleague the other day who works in Bangladesh, and he gave me the case of one girl. Her name is Dipali. She's 17 years old. The family is so poor that couldn't pay for her high school fees. So she dropped out, and then she got into the program supported by UNICEF. She really wanted to learn how to repair mobile phones. This is a skill that's in very high demand in the community. And then she says, you know what? People in the community told me I should instead learn to cook and learn to clean. But she continued. She continued because she was very, very determined and because she had a program that was supporting her, that was motivating her, and had some role models in the teachers also that told her, yeah, you can do it. So that's what we want to do. She will inspire other girls in the community, but we want all girls to be able to fly high above the prejudice and above the poverty. Again, one of the biggest differences between working in developing countries and in developed countries, the poverty rates that hold families back and girls back are so much higher.
Well, thank you. One question I have for all of you is, how do you accelerate the social, or I should say societal and cultural environment? In other words, we've been talking about how we can influence or change the mindset of women by having, many more visible role models, but not just women or girls. How do we make sure that the entire society shift their mindset, including men, parents, for example? And that is a very a big challenge for all countries, including Japan and US and developing countries. So if you have any, if you can share your thoughts in terms of what kind of policies, what sort of initiatives might be effective in order to shift the sort of entire cultural environment of the countries that you know or countries you have observed. Rie, do you have any thought, especially in Japan, when it comes to men? That's a big one to change. We can do a lot of different things to encourage girls and women. But what about men? What about the society?
These are really important questions. And I think the underlying context in all of our research or perhaps studies or operation is that the focus end up being so much on what girls need to do And we need to shift that dialogue to how we can support minoritized students and populations, which includes girls. When we think about that, I often think about this imagery of a revolving door, that perhaps what we might have to do is to create that revolving door where students can come in and out in the way that they want to, and that through those experiences that they can touch with some aspects of STEM and some ways in which that they could get experience and exposure to STEM. So I think that's one thing we can do. Another thing is at the policy level. I think it's important to implement certain policies that incentivizes companies, that incentivizes schools, incentivizes organizations to really promote this idea of gender equality. And without structural changes, I think it's really difficult to also change the perceptions of individuals like parents who are so geared towards university examinations, for example. And once we change the examination system, we don't change the incentive structure. So I think those are things that we might have to do more of.
Thank you. Nergis, do you have any thought on that in terms of what kind of policies or things that we should be promoting to accelerate the entire society sort of mindset?
Yeah, I mean, great question. So I'll just point out to a couple of things. So in 2020 in the US, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine published a report on it that was essentially on best practices for addressing the underrepresentation of women in STEM. And among their recommendations was committed leadership at all levels. And in the current setup in most places, the committed leadership is the men. And so you have to get them on board. And there are a few ways to do that. So Rie already talked about incentives. I think incentives is really, really important. And in addition to incentives, there should also be leveraging of resources, which means, I as dean, I hold certain resources of the school. And how do I leverage those to further the goals of creating equity for gender and other minoritized groups? So I think leveraging resources is another a part of the work that we have to do ahead. And then finally, I think economic arguments. So whether you're male or female, and I think Debora will be able to speak to this so much better than me, but economic arguments for why participation of women in your company, in your workforce, is actually better for your bottom line. So even if you don't want to do it out of ideas of decency or equality or fairness, economics. So I think we have to keep hitting on that. So those are sort of the things I would add.
On that point, economics, Debora, you actually mentioned in your presentation, if 100% secondary education is completed by women, that could boost GDP by 10%. That's economics. That's real money. That's what makes people that can be a motivation. That can just push people into to the right direction. So Debora, your comment about 10% GDP growth. How do you make sure that people get it? It's not okay. You want to be a nice person. It's human rights are important. Everything else, but at the end of the day, when people see 10% increase, I mean it's GDP or 10% of a salary, that's very powerful. How do you make sure that you can leverage that, the economic lever? What's your view on that?
Well, I think we need the evidence, and we need to keep the evidence up to date. That's important. I work for UNICEF, but I had a university career in economics, econometrics, statistics. We use data, and the data need to be constantly up to date. And yeah, I represent UNICEF, but I work hand in hand as much as possible with the World Bank, because we complement each other. Yes, the economic argument, but I also want to put in the political argument. because very few people disagree with human rights. Human rights being demanded by societies and demanded by the electorate. And guess what? 50% of the electorate is female, right? So economic argument, human rights, basic argument, but also the political arguments that governments are starting to react to. And then as a general, not solution, but a baseline for us, gender equality and access to education, access to STEM education, access to workforce, this needs to be very, very explicitly embedded in national development plans. We cannot expect this to happen by default as a trickle-down kind of side effect of development. It does not. And that is when we need to work side by side with government to provide that evidence and those arguments that will work from the national development planning perspective, and then within cabinets, within electoral campaigns, people in power need to become very, very proficient with the arguments, with the language, and with the evidence.
Great, thank you so much. I'm looking at the clock, and we have such an interesting conversation that time is flying. At this point, I would love to take some questions from the audience. If you have any questions, please send them through the Q&A channels, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible given within the time we have. So please go ahead and start sending questions. But let me just start off with one question before we get. So we already have one question. That's very quick. So what are the good ways to work together, different entities, to increase the profile of, say, successful role models? You are coming from different backgrounds, universities, and basic educational institutions, but also international organizations. Do you have any suggestions in terms of what kind of collaboration would be ideal? Maybe Debora, can you comment on that? What sort of collaboration between different organizations, and in your case you're representing international organizations, but collaboration with other entities to accelerate the change.
With entities with whom we have a common interest, I would just like to find one element of overlapping, something we should all jump on, that is listen and engage girls and women. Whatever we produce together cannot be top down. So all the strategies we develop, all the strategies we support, to be consistent with each other, need to start with that girl-centered approach. But also we should all work more with those groups, those networks, those organizations that are actually led by women, led by girls, that will allow us to tune in with their needs, but also highlight those role models that we need to show.
Well, thank you. The second question is a very difficult one. I mean, at least I struggle to come up with a good answer. So one of the challenges of finding women mentors in STEM is that those capable of mentoring are often responsible for more domestic labor than men. And what are some strategies to make it easier for early and mid-career women to mentor younger women in the field? It's true. The reality is still women tend to bear more responsibilities at home. So that makes it a little bit more difficult for women to spare time to perhaps mentor other women, and so on and so forth. Do you have any suggestions on this issue? Maybe Nergis, do you have any suggestions on this?
I do. I was raising my finger because I this is something I've thought about a lot, and this is a place where leadership can make a really big difference. In that we understand in most of our workplaces that women do a bunch of hidden labor, playing roles as mentors to other women, but also to other parts of our population. And so the one way to address that, there are two important things. One is to value mentorship as part of your job. As soon as we do that, then it becomes part of the job, and then it becomes on equal footing with something else that's part of your job that you won't do. So for me, as a leader in an academic department, if my women colleagues are doing disproportionate amount of mentoring, which they are, then maybe they don't have to write the qualifying exam this year. You know what I mean? So you have to balance out workload. And you can only do that if you value mentorship as part of real meaningful work that promotes the goals of the organization. And so that would be my number one answer. It's in the hands of leaders. It is not in the hands of women to go convince their families to let them do less work. That's a great thing, but really it can start in the workplace.
Interesting. Next question. Do you believe that the low participation in STEM in general is also due to a mentality perpetuated generation after generation, which discourages young people, especially women, of pursuing higher degrees in any field? Rie, what do you think of this statement?
Yeah, there's, I think it kind of goes back to our discussion about social, cultural factors that play a role in the way girls perceive themselves within the sphere of STEM. Certainly, I think that notion comes from the parents that you might have, that if they are supportive of you doing so well in mathematics or science, then certainly that student will feel empowered and have more confidence to pursue STEM. So certainly I think that low participation is quite associated with those social, cultural factors. Now, how to overcome that, I think, is a big factor, but perhaps having even role models. I think one of the things that I realized in Japan is that there are very few women STEM role models. And I think that's also another factor. Representation matters. And the fact that perhaps younger students can imagine themselves and identify themselves to be someone like that accomplished STEM woman, I think, is really quite important. So ways in which we can elevate women STEM experts. And I think there are many hidden heroes that we just don't know about, or we haven't highlighted them. I think there needs to be some concerted effort to have those stories and those stories of individuals to be shared with younger generation.
Yeah, I guess your statement is really on the same line with what Nergis said earlier about how visualization is important to make it very visible to everybody, especially women, is important in terms of promoting role models. Next question. What have been the experiences with engaging policymakers in these programs to support systematic changes? Which policymakers have you been successful in engaging, and what have been the results? This is in the context of education policy. Maybe this one is a good for Debora. Do you have any view on this? Policymakers who have been trying to promote this issue. What are the effective ones that you have seen so far?
Policymakers, I'll go to my own professional experience. In my previous job before becoming regional director here, I was actually UNICEF representative in Indonesia.
Well, Indonesia, right?
Indonesia, yeah. And it's one of those countries with still very high child marriage rates. And somehow we thought that this would be politically difficult to approach, that government would not be that open. How wrong we were. We just had to really try. One, provide the evidence why child marriage would affect the educational opportunities of girls, then their employment opportunities, how it would then result in early pregnancy, how this had an impact on child and maternal mortality, would also have an impact on stunting. And this was coming together with the anti-stunting campaign that the president was launching. We went ahead providing the evidence and finding like-minded people in some key government offices. Of course, we had an automatic alliance with the Ministry of Family and Children, but then we had a strong alliance also with the Ministry of Planning. And then we had a strong alliance coming with clerics that, against our own misconceptions, were actually very much prepared to help campaign against child marriage. So all these forces together, identifying the arguments that they would listen to, but also identify in government those people that would want to be our champions. And we actually managed to change the legislation to make it much more difficult even to obtain, how's it called? It's a special dispensation, so that even if there is a certain minimum age for marriage, you could have dispensation by the religious authorities. And we work together to make that much more difficult. Again, get all those involved together, pick your champions and run with them.
Thank you. So next one is about education or educators. Educators seem to agree that a solid mathematical foundation is essential to a meaningful and successful STEM path. How do we convince the U.S. educational leaders and the U.S. students that this step is absolutely necessary? So this is obviously for Nergis, because it's about U.S. education. Nergis, do you have any view on this one?
Yeah, so I think my answer is actually going to be quite similar to the story that Deborah told. Education is in the U.S. has unfortunately become extremely politicized, and as a result, you have to work with all the stakeholders, pick your champions, and education in the U.S. is also extremely ununiform. So, your educational experience is almost entirely tied to the socioeconomic status of the neighborhood in which your house happens to be at the lower levels. So I think you have to engage policymakers and lawmakers at every level, at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local level. But there is no dispute that a strong mathematical foundation is essential. There is some lack of understanding of what that strength should be and how to come about it. So my answer is very similar to Deborah's. You have to just engage stakeholders. And I do think there's one other thing that I don't even know if I should say on this big public forum, but in the US at least, we have to get educators into the place of making education policy, not politicians, not political appointees, but educators. And we're not there.
Very good point. Where are educators in decision-making positions? That's a very good point. So interesting questions and obviously very thought-provoking answers. Thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, I think we are really running out of time. We could spend another 2 hours just talking about this profoundly important question. But let me just try to summarize. I don't know how I can do this well, but I'll do my best. Listening to all the three speakers' presentations, definitely one very, very strong underlying theme is it's a mindset. It's what's in the mind of women and girls, but also men as well. It's not a question of intelligence. It's a question of culture. It's a question of mindset. Rie, very well articulated. These are self-efficacy, self-concept, and motivation. And Nergis, you said it's the cultural barrier, it's the bias. These are the things that prevent women from taking a step into STEM field and other professional fields that are seen as more male than female. In reality, there's no reason why certain things should be more male than female, but it's the biases and cultural barriers. And also on a similar line, Debora, you explained how gender norms are extremely, extremely powerful when it comes to creating a sort of cultural environment where certain behaviors are encouraged or discouraged, which can oftentimes lead to, unfortunately, lower education or educational opportunities for girls and women versus boys. Boys are given some kind of robotics toys when girls are given, pink dolls at the very early stages of their lives. So if you think about all these things that are happening in different societies, different economies, whether in Japan or US or developing economies, that underlying theme of mindset, biases, cultural norms, extremely important factor when we want to come up with a strategy to really accelerate this big change, big shift, to make sure there are no more biases, there are no more sort of prejudice that's imposed on girls and women versus on boys. So I would say, again, not that I think I can come up with a perfect recommendations, I would say what we need to do is to look at this issue on a very, very, from a very top-down, holistic level, and make sure that not only systems, right policies and systematic approach taken, but also cultural, societal environment is in place. This means families. This means social media. This means schools, obviously, different level schools, starting with early education, middle school, high school, universities, and in graduate schools, and obviously the labor market. And it has to be consistent through different stages of people's lives. It has to be consistent in terms of different segments of the entire society, in terms of what the approach or what the initiatives are going to resolve in terms of the, again, cultural barriers, again, prejudice, again, quite frankly, it's the mindset of both men and women. So again, thank you so much for joining us. Unfortunately, this is the end of the very important conversation. I hope all of you enjoyed this very thought-provoking discussion. So again, thank you so much, Rie and Nergis and Debora. I'm calling you by first names for incredibly important observations and suggestions you have made. So again, thank you so much. And just one final request to all of you: when you leave the webinar, please post the webinar survey will be displayed on your screen. So we will really appreciate it if you could answer it and provide us your feedback. It takes only a few minutes. On behalf of our organizers, thank you so much again for joining us today. And please have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.